What's going on YouTube? I am back with another video. I'm finally starting to feel better. As I told you guys, I was really sick over the Thanksgiving break, which was kind of annoying because I didn't get to eat very much pie. But in this video, I'm gonna do another story video, if you will, or stories of what it was like working at a flight school for 4 years. So stick around and I'll tell you some of that. Okay, so the first thing you gotta understand about flight schools is they are not all created equal. They don't all operate the same aircraft, and they don't all operate under the same conditions per se. So the flight school that I worked at was at a non-controlled airport. There wasn't a tower, and there wasn't anything to worry with that. Now there's other flight schools that I've been to where obviously they're at a controlled airport. There's even flight schools at international airports where there's heavy traffic and stuff like that as well. But the one that I worked at was just kind of a small town flight school outside of San Antonio. And I won't say exactly where it was. They have since moved, but I'm not gonna say their name either. I'm sorry. It's just a flight school in San Antonio, Texas. I realize there's only 8 of those, but pick one and assume it was that one. So we had a fleet of 172s, and when I say a fleet, I mean we had 2, but one of them changed 3 times. So we had our main aircraft, which was one of the owner's aircraft, and then we had one on leaseback, and then that guy took it back from the school for whatever the reason, and then we had a different one on leaseback, and then we got rid of that one, and then another owner bought an airplane to put on lease back with us, and that aircraft is still flying in the fleet. It's one of the 172s. We also had a Geronimo and an Arrow. For a little while we had a Cherokee 140, and we also had a Cherokee 160 at one point. The Cherokee 140 was actually pretty cool because it had a 180 horsepower engine on it, so that was actually a lot of fun. But in working with a flight school, you're working on general aviation aircraft, typically, and then some flight schools fly brand new Cirrus, some flight schools fly brand new Diamond DA-20s, which are great airplanes, but for us, we were working on older 60s, 70s, and 80s 172s and Pipers, and you know, with that comes a certain amount of furnishings replacements, if you will, because students seem to believe that a flight school aircraft is the most robust piece of machinery that was ever created or designed and will literally tear aircraft up. And I'm like, okay, if you got in a 60s hot rod, would you slam the door that hard? And the answer is no, but students always do. They just tear up the airplanes. So you're constantly fixing what seems like just little things, little cracks or broken seat handles or a worn seat roller, or just, you know, little stuff like that, because the aircraft are getting used so heavily and you're constantly replacing those things. But I remember there's probably a dozen times I could count where a student drug the aircraft over to the maintenance hangar, because the maintenance hangar was separate from the flight school hangar. But a student would drag the hangar or the aircraft over, and they tell us it's not starting, we don't know what's wrong with it, or it's running really rough, it won't pass a mag check. I'm having all these issues, right? And on several occasions, it was, well, it would help if you put the primer all the way back in, or in one of the aircraft, it would help if you turn the key on, stuff like that. So, you know, students sometimes they miss something little and they immediately assume it's a maintenance issue, and they'll drag it over to the maintenance hangar and they'll want you to fix it, and it's some little switchology thing like that, like the key's not on. And you always feel bad because you don't want to be rude, you don't want to be an ass about the situation, but you're like, yeah, bro, there's nothing wrong with the plane. It's just you got to turn the key on. But I can remember another time we had this Arrow, and they still have the Arrow, but I swear this aircraft was cursed. In the time that I worked on it, it went through 4 cylinders and a turbo. So it's a Turbo Arrow 3, it had a Continental IO 360 on it, or sorry, a TSIO 360 on it, with an intercooler STC so that it made 225 horsepower. It was brand new from Continental in 2001. It had like 1,000 hours on it. And in one scenario, I remember it split the cylinder at the barrel and the head, and that actually almost came off in flight on one of the owners of the flight school. And at the same time, to replace that cylinder, we found a piston pin, and the piston pin went like this, so we ended up replacing that piston and cylinder. A little while later, for what seemed like no reason, one of the exhaust valves came apart and went through a turbo. on with a renter in the aircraft, so he had to circle back and make an emergency landing, and we ended up having to do another cylinder on that aircraft. And don't get me wrong, it was always a good airplane. It's just it's always needed something. It's always kind of been one of those airplane that sits in maintenance a lot. But I think one of the most interesting things for me, we had an airworthiness inspector. His name was Carlos, and he works obviously airworthiness inspector, FAA, right? For a short time, we had a 135, and he worked in San Antonio. Our flight school was outside of San Antonio, but he lived in the next town closest to ours. And on Fridays, he liked to catch the football games. So what he would do is he would leave the office about noon after lunch, and then on his way home, he would swing by and he would check in on us and do an inspection, and then he would depart and go catch the football games. So there was a period when football season, when we would see him not weekly, but every couple of weeks, every single Friday. You could bet if the next town over was having a football game, he would be there. So that was always interesting and something fun to deal with. As far as the maintenance side of things went, though, it always seemed that, and this is why I didn't like working for a flight school, even though at the time I was single, and the flight school is actually where I met my wife. I did another video, which was I married a cougar, and I had said that we met at a flight school, and this was that flight school. But at the time I was single, but it would just so happen that every time an aircraft ran out of its 100-hour or its 50-hour, or it needed a major inspection on an AD, it was always on a Friday at like 2 o'clock. And my boss would say something along the lines of, well, we're all gonna have to stay late until the aircraft is finished. And there was probably a dozen times or so where we would stay on a Friday until almost 11 o'clock at night or 12 o'clock at night doing a 100-hour inspection on one of the flight school airplanes so that it could fly the next day, because it had flights scheduled for Saturday and for Sunday. And obviously Saturday and Sunday maintenance isn't there, so we're not going to be able to be working on the airplane, and it's overdue for a 100-hour inspection. And I remember that would always get a little bit annoying, but it was one of those things that kind of happened. And like I said, it just always seemed that it happened on a Friday. It never happened on a Thursday or a Wednesday, and it always happened on a Friday, like when you had something planned, like you were going to go out with the boys, or I was going to take my wife on a date. And at that point, she was just my girlfriend, but we were going to go on a date, and that's when it would happen. And fortunately, she understood because she had worked there, so she knew I wasn't lying to her or anything like that. But between that, and then we also did FBO maintenance, so we worked on flight school aircraft, if you will. So between balancing the FBO of customer aircraft and working on customers' aircraft, as well as somebody would have to jump off because one of the flight school aircraft needs an oil change, and get that oil change done, and then immediately jump back on and try to pick up where you left off on the customer aircraft. It was just kind of like this constant juggling match of doing the flight school and doing the FBO. And then it did get a little bit worse. Well, maybe not worse. It got better, I guess you could say, because the flight school and the FBO actually separated, and the flight school moved into San Antonio, and the FBO stayed in the small town. And at that point, anytime one of the flight school aircraft needed something, they would bring it over to us, unless it was down for maintenance over there, like something that it couldn't fly, and then we'd have to go over there. But it was a little better because we at least knew it was coming, instead of just immediately, hey, we got to do an oil change on this aircraft. But there you go, everybody. I hope you found this video somewhat enjoyable. Keep an eye out. I'm going to be launching my December giveaways next week. I'm going to do one of them back-to-back consecutively each week, so stick around for those. As always, leave us a like, leave us a comment, subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. Go build something and be easy.